That's a lot of workers, I would
That's
think.
a lot of
and
workers.
all these kids that we use on the cherry farm, they're back in school.
They are back in school. We're heavily dependent on migrant workers.
Okay.
It is one of our our growers' top concerns in the United States at this point.
And they mostly come from the southern states, and they spend basically the summers to early fall here.
Yes, migrant workers very typically probably getting started with asparagus in April, and they might do that for 8 weeks. Then they may go
Cherries, strawberries.
celeries.
Yep.
I mean, they're following crops right around the state, wrapping up their season usually with apples. Yes.
And I know with the homeland security issues, this has been a real contentious kind of issue. I know it's federal, but just to touch on it briefly, where do you see it headed? Because the farmers really rely heavily on these migrants to come to help them pick.
They do.
So you want to give us a brief summary of what's going on there?
Years ago, your migrant worker was typically maybe from the Ozarks and then from Florida, Texas, and nowadays they're really coming primarily from Mexico. And we just absolutely depend on them. You can't, as you pointed out, have all your investment in spraying and then not be able to bring in your crops. So industry, I have 50-year-old men looking at me saying, this is the most worried I have been about the apple industry in my lifetime in terms of getting workers. So if it isn't solved perhaps by summer, it's highly likely that the presidential election will eclipse a controversial issue. So it's
really?
very, very urgent.
And how to get them here to help pick.
Yes.
And obviously they pick for other farm commodities, not just apples.
Yes, and so the guest worker program is what the President Bush has talked about, and that's what we just need the H-2A program fixed. Yes.
Yeah, but an important component to getting the apple off. Obviously.
Absolutely. Yes.
So, and now the apples, after they're picked, they go into this huge box.
Yes.
How many pounds in one of those boxes? We call them tanks, but obviously they're not a tank.
Yes, but they have the slats, so they don't hold water in the apple industry. But they probably hundreds of pounds of apples will be in there.
And you pick them in a pail and then put them in the box?
Yes, they're picked in workers typically have a harness that they wear. There's a sack in front of them. What's really important is you have to think every single apple, nobody wants to buy an apple with a bruise. So they have to be placed in. You don't drop them, and certainly
a lot of care is taken.
Yes, so you handle them very, very carefully. Then you climb down the ladder if that's what's necessary, put them into the bin. And the bins then by day's end will be taken out of the field, put almost immediately into cold storage. Perhaps there's some kind of a rinse that they would need before they would go into cold storage. And some of them go into controlled atmosphere storage, which is where you are sucking down the oxygen level and essentially putting that apple to sleep at somewhere between 34 and 38 degrees Fahrenheit. And taking them out. We can pack apples in Michigan for 11 months of the year at least.
Okay.
So,
well, let's talk about some of the legislation that affects apple growers here in Michigan. You said that in the Senate, Senator Jerry Van Workum from Muskegon is working on some legislation. Then we certainly have the ongoing budget talks. You want to touch on some of that?
Well, certainly. Senator Van Workum will very shortly reintroduce a bill that had been introduced a year ago. It's taken some time to kind of work out some details, but it's on the issue of abandoned or neglected orchards. As people retire or maybe they downsize, they're moving to some of these more higher density orchards. They may not need all of the land. And sometimes people either can't afford to or don't bother removing some of the older trees. And the problem with that is it becomes a harbor for insects or diseases.
Right.
And then you as the grower are spraying 2 or 3 times where you would only need to spray 1 time, and it just takes us the wrong direction environmentally. So we need a new law that has due process. This law has been on the books for abandoned orchards since 1941, and it just needs to be updated in terms of some of the clauses that are in it that allow the ag director to take action instead of allowing a harbor for insects directly next to or within a half a mile of a commercial orchard. So we're real hopeful that will be fixed.
What are the, like in cherries, we have the cherry fruit fly.
You're saying not to gesture. I know you're looking at me.
Oh, no, go ahead. Whatever you want to do.
Okay, I didn't know.
So we were talking a little bit about the insect problem that apples have. In cherries, we have the nasty cherry fruit fly that if you don't spray at an appropriate time, it can damage the whole crop. And you can't take the crop to market. So what particular insect is damaging to the apple?
Well, apples probably have a few dozen insect pests that we worry about, but number one, and by far and away, is the codling moth. And the damage.
Moth.
Codling moth, yes, and then you worry about the larvae that burrow in or make stings on the surface of the fruit, and then as the fruit enlarges, becomes more obvious as the season goes on. Plum curculio is another one, apple maggot, there's another one that's going to burrow inside the apple. That's probably your notorious worm in the apple that we don't ever want to see.
Right.
And there are other pests too, but those are three that are really, really
Pretty
important
big,
to
a
us.
lot, quite a few compared to the cherries or whatever. So.
Yes, I think there are at least 50 pests of of apples that we have to worry about.
Oh,
so,
I didn't realize
plus
that.
the diseases.
So there is really a reason if the consumer really likes a beautiful red apple, and so to make sure that it's a beautiful red apple, you must make sure it's not contaminated, and thus you have to spray, I assume.
Yes, there are certainly inputs that go on that apple.
Yeah.
What's very dramatic is the change that integrated pest management has brought about over the last 25 years.
IPM.
IPM.
You might want to say this a little slower, because when I talk to people about IPM, they really don't understand what IPM is.
Integrated pest management is where even 20 years ago, you would spray your chemicals by the calendar.
Right,
Every other
10
Monday,
days,
exactly.
Right.
And now we are into individuals who are insect scouts, and so they go through orchards. There are traps that are placed with pheromone, sex scent is what it's really called, of the insect in the trap. And when you reach a certain level of population,
then you spray.
So you're spraying when you need it instead of when the calendar says. And that has made a dramatic difference. If you, Senator, if you look at the data, you can see we've had a 70% reduction in insecticide use over the last 20 years. It's very dramatic.
It's good for the environment, but it's also good for the farmer, because then that reduces their costs. Because chemicals are obviously the biggest cost.
And better control, more apples that we can sell on that fresh market.
Sure. Now, we touched a little bit on the legislation that Senator Van Workum is working on. Now, what's in the budget that is important for Michigan apples?
Yes. Boy, we depend. There are a lot of things in the budget that are important to agriculture and therefore important to apples. One of the more popular programs right now is the Select Michigan program. Apple Committee is a big fan of that, where we can promote a whole series of Michigan things, from asparagus to peaches to vegetables to apples, potatoes. We are a participant in that with a lot of grower money.
So when you say you're very excited about it and you promote, how do you promote?
We will do in stores. The partners here are Kroger, Meijer, Spartan Stores. Farmer Jack has been in the past.
To buy Michigan products, Michigan agriculture products.
Yes, and so they might be doing demonstrations in the store, sampling. There's different kinds of signage. Our partners, the Spartan Stores, Meijer in particular, up in your district, have been very good supporters of this. So that's an exciting promotional program. What's also really important to us, some of the nuts and bolts that people, general public might not think about, such as the Michigan Agricultural Statistics Service. That lets us count, the cherry business and the apple business, every 3 years, how many new trees have gone in, what varieties there are, what size of tree, all of these different kinds of things. And then how we use that information, we get contacted by bakers or makers of apple products, and they want to know, they're tweaking the recipe, and they want to know, are you still planting this kind of apple? Well, yes, we are. In fact, our growers put in so many trees 2 years ago, and then they can rest assured, all right, I can leave that recipe alone for the next couple of years.
I see.
And that really shores up, is one example of how that shores up the use of Michigan apples. So the Ag Statistics Service is important to us. Fruit and vegetable inspectors, that's what allows us to sell
food
apples.
Safety.
Yes, food safety to schools, to the Department of Defense, inspectors to Mexico. The fruit and vegetable inspectors from the state are absolutely critical to that work as well.
Now you're really trying hard to get apples that are grown in Michigan to be sold in Michigan schools, Michigan universities. How are you going about doing that?